Hey there, I'm Liz Chapman, and if you're wanting to start a podcast and you want to make sure you're in the right place for success, this is where you need to be. Today, we're going to cover one of the most important steps in launching a podcast, and that's going to be to clarify your purpose and your audience. And this is a step that I find often gets overlooked, but it's one of the crucial steps. If you watched last week's video, I talked about how if you think about a house of cards, you need to have that stable base or the entire thing is going to collapse. And that's like your podcast. You need to have really solid foundation. So you do want to put a lot of time and effort into figuring out these core pieces before you get into things like naming your podcast and what kind of microphone and all the things that we like to focus on, which are important, but the foundations are very, very important. And before we get started, don't forget to download my Launch Your Podcast Roadmap. It has everything you need to get started from setting your foundations all the way through launch day. And you can grab that link in the description below. Okay, so why is defining your podcast purpose so critical? So if we're thinking of our podcast purpose as the foundation of your entire show, if you don't have a purpose, it's really easy to struggle with creating the content, with knowing who you're talking to, with knowing what those pain points are, really what your whole show is going to be about. So you want to ask yourself, what do you want to achieve with your podcast? Are you aiming to educate your audience, inspire them, or position yourself as that expert and go-to in your field? So when you're clear on your purpose, when you're clear on who your audience is, when you're clear on what kind of content you're going to create, it makes life so much easier. For example, content creation can definitely be a struggle for most of us. And I recently invested in a content creation course, and I'll link it below because it's been great. It's based off human design, all of the things I didn't really understand until I started taking Jen's course. It's great. I'll link it below. So I told myself I was going to commit fully to the process. And one of her exercises was diving into that client persona, diving into the audience, diving into like the pain points, all those things that I would typically skip. But because I committed myself to this process, I ended up doing all of the work. And let me tell you, it has been so much easier when I sit down to create content to pull stories and to link them to pain points or link them to success stories, all those things that we hear about and we don't really know how to do it. So it's really been very valuable to me that I went through that process with her, even though I didn't think I needed to. So same thing with you. Take the time to go through this process. I promise you it will help. So depending on what your niche is, there's going to be a lot of podcasts in that space. So you need something that really makes you stand out amongst other people that are talking about similar topics. So that's one of the things you should focus on when you're figuring out your podcast foundations is what makes you unique. What makes you unique in your space? And then infuse that into your content so that you don't sound like everybody else and so that you're standing out among the other people in your niche. Okay, next you need to have a listener's journey, and I talk about this with my clients often. If I find your podcast and I start listening, what do I do next? What should my journey look like when I find your podcast? Do you want me listening to your podcast and then you funnel me down into your email list with a free resource? And then once I'm on your email list, I continue to be nurtured by you. And then eventually I funnel down into your paid offerings and your paid coaching. So that would be like what a listener's journey looks like. Your podcast is the top of the funnel, and then your offerings are the bottom of the funnel. And you want to make sure when you have a call to action in your podcast episode that it's very clear. We don't want to have a call to action that's like, join my email for more tips. Probably not going to get many people joining your email. However, if you had something very specific, and I'll use one of my clients as an example, her call to action in her episodes are, she has a guide, 15 wines under $15, that if you go on her email list, you get this guide full of wine under $15. That's valuable. She grows her email list from that every single podcast episode. So we went from vague of join my email list for tips to you're getting this valuable resource, and then you're on my list, and now I can start nurturing you in addition to nurturing you through the podcast. And speaking of call to actions, you want to have a call to action in all of your episodes. However, you do not want to have so many calls to actions that it's overwhelming and your listener doesn't know what to do. So if you have 4 to 5 calls to action, you know what they're going to do? Nothing. So you really want to have one call to action. Do you want them to subscribe, like, and leave a review? Do you want them to grab your guide? Do you want them to grab this free resource? What is that one thing you want them to do? And here's a tip. Don't put your call to action at the end, because most of the time people check out towards the end of the episode. So you want that call to action to be in the beginning or the middle of your episode. Try not to leave it for the end of your episode. Okay, so that's it for today on clarifying your purpose and who your audience is, who you're talking to. And if you're ready to start your own podcast, you can grab my Launch Your Podcast Roadmap, which is right at the link below. It's planned with everything you need to launch your podcast, from the beginning with the foundations all the way through launch date. So make sure you grab that guide. Thanks for watching. And next week, we're going to dive into choosing the right podcast format and structure. See you then.